This is Outrageous History.
Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. In June of 1879, the famous Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman addressed the graduating class of the Michigan Military Academy. He stated to the graduates, "There is many a boy here today who looks on war as all glory, but boys, it is all hell." I think it's safe to say that anyone involved in combat would agree with that. Military leaders during the Second World War seemed to be well aware of that reality, and to help lighten, even just a little bit, the spirit of the soldiers in the European theater, they created special services which brought famous and not so famous entertainers to military bases. To reach soldiers on the rapidly advancing front lines, small units of entertainers would be sent there by jeep, sometimes entertaining only a couple of miles from the fighting. Those units may not be well known, but were served by well-known entertainers such as Mickey Rooney, Red Skelton, and Sammy Davis Jr. Author Robert O'Connor's most recent book, a novel called Jeep Show, a Trouper at the Battle of the Bulge, tells the story of one such entertainer, Private Jim Tanzer, who's assigned to the Morale Corps to help entertain the troops, but finds himself thrust in the middle of one of the biggest battles of the war, the Battle of the Bulge in eastern Belgium. Incidentally, it's the 80th anniversary of that battle. I found this novel highly readable with lots of humor, but it also speaks to the messy realities of life and death in the combat zone. We have Robert here today with us to discuss those realities. Robert, thanks for being here with us today.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. Really my pleasure. Thanks for having me and letting me speak with you and your audience.
Robert, this story is based very much on the life of a real person. Who was that person and what led you to write this novel?
The real person was a man named Jim Hetzer. Jim Hetzer was a unsuccessful actor, show business person before the war in the late 30s. He tried to break into show business in New York, didn't quite make it. Became a dance instructor back in his hometown of Huntington, West Virginia, and then volunteered for the Army in 1944. He was 29 years old and he had a daughter. And as many of your listeners will know, the local draft boards almost never drafted fathers in World War II. I became interested in Jim Hetzer because, and his service in the Morale Corps a few years ago. I was going through a hard time in my life, things we all go through, but during that period, I became fascinated by the topic of morale. There's a famous quote from Napoleon that says, "Morale is to the material as 3 is to 1." And I think a very recent example of the rebels in Syria overcoming the very well-equipped Syrian army in a matter of days does show the importance of morale. I wrote a book on the topic of morale, a nonfiction book called Gumption Aid, and then I learned about Jim Hetzer and contacted his daughter, who is very much still living. She told me that all the letters that he wrote home from the European theater of operations in World War II were saved by his older sister, her aunt. And they were actually published in a book. So I got a hold of that book and had a couple of hundred letters, primary sources of this relatively unknown Army job, MOS, Military Occupation Specialty 442, literally enlisted entertainer. Because of my interest in the concept of morale, I felt I wanted to write about these enlisted entertainers in World War II. I chose to write fiction because I wanted to tell it in a historically accurate story. I wanted the book to be available not just to people that have a high interest and have read a lot about World War II, although they will be interested in this little known aspect, but I also wanted the story to be available to people who might find all the nonfiction books, and there's many excellent ones about World War II, they may find them to be a little bit intimidating. So that's it. There was a gentleman named Jim Hetzer. I learned about his life. He was not involved in the Battle of the Bulge. He was, I think, in Holland, working at the time. But as you said, the Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle the American Army had ever fought. It was a turning point towards the end of the war, and the siege of Bastogne, thanks to the excellent miniseries Band of Brothers and other works, is fairly well known to most Americans. I will say that I have Jim, as he retreats from the frontline attack, he does end up in Bastogne, and he does join a group called Team Snafu. And many people know what Snafu stands for. This is a family broadcast, so I won't go into it. But he joins Team Snafu, and Team Snafu in Bastogne was put together with rear echelon soldiers that were trapped there, telephone operators, barbers, bandsmen, and then some soldiers in infantry companies that had been overrun and had been able to retreat to Bastogne. So another little known aspect of that time in the war was the contribution of these irregulars, Team Snafu, to supporting the famous 101st Airborne at Bastogne.
Well, the role of the Special Services / Morale Corps, as it is in your novel, it might be understated in our modern view of warfare. In the international conflicts that we've been witness to, say, since the Korean War, they don't seem to really mention a lot about maintaining the morale of the troops. Yet in the Second World War, as we now see in your book, morale and thus the entertainment component were taken very seriously, weren't they?
Absolutely. In fact, these entertainment soldiers had they had a specialty, and it was doing jeep shows, going to just behind the front lines and bringing entertainment to combat soldiers whom the USO and the Red Cross could not reach because it was too dangerous and too difficult. As I think I said, although I call it Morale Corps, the actual name after 1942 was Special Services. And not only did they have these entertainment soldiers doing live performances for combat soldiers, they also showed a lot of movies. This would be in the rear echelon or wherever they could put up a screen. But Hollywood went out of their way to deliver to the Army first-run films, and sometimes they were seen in Europe by soldiers before they were seen in America by the regular audience. They also supplied athletic equipment. So there'd be a wooden box and there'd be a catcher's mitt inside it and some baseballs and bats. And they also supplied what are called armed services editions. The Army supplied millions of books, popular books at the time, that were printed in a format, imagine something about half the size of a regular book, and printed vertically instead of horizontally. And they did that because it was less expensive, but also these books could be easily fit in the pocket of a field jacket. so that the soldiers at the front line could carry a book with them at all times. So there were many. Oh, and by the way, a famous book at the time, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, was by far the most popular book among American soldiers. And the author of that book received thousands and thousands of letters from frontline soldiers. So special services, or what I call the morale corps, did many, many things. But for me, the most interesting and certainly the most dangerous was what the entertainment soldiers did just behind the front lines.
And Mickey Rooney played a prominent role in your book because of his major involvement in the special services and the Jeep shows themselves. You know, we all kind of view Mickey as this over-the-top character, but along with actually being on the front lines, he remained a loyal supporter of the U.S. military right up until his passing. I found several stories about him on military websites in which he was really lauded for his support.
Absolutely. And I think part of that is people, men and women that have served, have a special insight into other people that have served or are serving. And Mickey Rooney certainly did his service. Interesting. He's a fascinating character. He was the leading box office star in America in 1938 and 1939. Can you imagine the leading box office star now joining the Army and doing simple entertainments for frontline soldiers? I'd like to think it would happen. Rooney was considered an absolute genius by directors he worked with and other actors. In his personal life, he was absolutely off the rails. He absolutely off the rails, and completely lacked the discipline that he had so much when he was acting. His boss at MGM by 1944 was getting a little tired of Mickey Rooney's private life, and there was some pressure for leading actors and other famous men of draft age to serve. So Mickey volunteered for the Army. Again, to his credit, he could have served in Hollywood. There was a studio where actors and actresses filmed movies for the Signal Corps. And Ronald Reagan, for example, served there as an officer. But Rooney, and that would have been about 10 minutes from Rooney's house in Hollywood. Rooney chose to go to Europe and be in the European Theater of Operations, and he did many things, but the thing that interested me the most is he was the leader of a Jeep show squad, and this real person, Jim Hetzer, that I found out about was in Mickey Rooney's Jeep show squad. So they and one other performer, one other enlisted performer, who was probably played the accordion or the guitar, or was probably a musician, would literally drive to just behind the front lines and do these shows. What in the book Mickey calls them the K-ration version of a variety show, in that it's not quite as good but a lot more portable. And they would do as many as 10 or 11 shows a day.
Wow.
Going up the lines. Yeah. And they, by December of 1944, when the book is set and most of the chapters happen, the American Army had advanced much more quickly out of France than the generals had expected. And they had set up a very thin line of defense right up to the German border, and essentially were waiting for the winter to end to plan the attacks on the German homeland. What happened, of course, was Hitler came up with this incredibly risky and misguided scheme to have a massive counterattack in December against the American forces. his idea was that he would split the American forces from the British forces, and somehow then that would cause the Americans and British to sue for peace, and then Hitler would turn all his attention to the Russians, who were steadily moving west towards Berlin. It was a harebrained idea. His generals tried to get him to abandon the plan and just focus on the defense of Germany, but he did not. And so on December 16th, 1944, about 120,000 German soldiers and over 1,000 tanks burst through a lightly defended area in the Ardennes, in Luxembourg and Belgium, and made about a 25-mile inroad, which at the time was called a Bulge, and that is why we now call it the Battle of the Bulge. They made a significant inroad there, and then were turned back after about a week. They were turned back, but so I thought that was a very important battle from a historical standpoint. The Americans lost 19,000 killed, about 48,000 wounded, and about 23,000 missing or captured. And the German losses were about 3 times as much. So I wanted to get my character involved in that and involved in the defense of Bastogne.
You also placed a lot of emphasis on the situation in which Jim found himself in Germany through the last phase of the war and after the war had actually ended. For instance, you described the disturbing Russian military presence in Berlin and the issue of displaced persons. Both of those are very real problems in this shattered Germany. Tell us about your reasons for including these two troubling aspects in your novel.
First of all, I wanted to paint an accurate picture of what it was like to be a soldier in the army in World War II. And we had so many troops in Europe that we did not have enough transportation to get them home after the end of the war. And I will also add that when the Germans surrendered, which was in early May of 1945, all of the troops, particularly the combat troops, were sure that they would be sent to the Far East for the invasion of Japan. And when the Japanese surrendered in late August of 1945 and ended the war, as I said, there were millions and millions of American soldiers in Europe. We could not get them all home in any quick fashion. There was so many soldiers were sent to Germany for the occupation of Germany. My father was actually sent to the south of France to school while he waited for his boat ride home. So I wanted to give that experience. The main character, Jim Tanzer, does not have enough points to get home quickly. They had a point system whereby soldiers were awarded points for how long they had been serving, how long they had been serving overseas, whether they had been wounded, what combat actions they had been involved in. And the main character in the book, because he is in the entertainment corps, he feels that he has not been given the credentials that he should have based on his experience, and he is stuck in Germany for about a year waiting for his turn to get home. Having established that, it was fascinating to learn about what it was like in Germany after the war ended. And as you said, the German industrial capacity and much of the housing in the larger cities had been decimated. And then there was a huge influx of Germans who had lived, basically the Russians, as they went east, pushed all the Germans out of Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, these Eastern European countries where Germans had been living for generations, and they were combed out by the Russians moving east, and basically, as one character says, Berlin became the world's largest boarding house. And then there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of, as you said, displaced persons who were liberated from concentration camps and slave labor camps, and most of them did not want to go home. Most of them were Jewish, and they really did not want to go back to where they had been before the war, because even though the Germans were gone, there was plenty of anti-Semites left in these Eastern countries. So the displaced persons waited in their own camps. They were the guests of the United States at that point, and as you probably have noted, the main character is assigned to do an amateur show at one of the camps in order to give the displaced people something to do other than roam around, and some of them steal and terrorize the remaining Germans.
With this entertainment aspect, I found the backstory and flashbacks to Jim and Stella's entertainment career, and Stella was Jim's wife, of course. I found that really interesting. It brought depth to the Jim character. Where did you pick up the 1930s and 1940s entertainment jargon and performance routines and procedures?
Well, the jargon, the dialect, I really wanted to be as true as possible to the way people actually talked. And so I watched several movies. I read several novels from the period, particularly the Philip Marlowe hard-boiled detective novels. I did not use all his hard-boiled detective words and phrases, but it was very useful. And then I also listened to recordings of radio broadcasts at the time. As you know, the 30s was when radio really took over in America as a social force. So I had examples of the way people talked and the way people talk differently. And the one word that just came through that we don't use much anymore, that they used all the time in the 30s and 40s, was swell, SWELL. Things, and we still have that word, and if I use it, people know what I mean. But that was I stuck wherever I could. I tried to take words that we would still understand today, but have become archaic, and put them in. When you write a novel, and this was my first novel, so of course the first thing I did was go out and buy a book called How to Write a Novel or something like that. And one of the pieces of advice is put in a lot of dialogue, because if you put in long paragraphs of description in a novel, people will skip that, and they'll skip ahead to the dialogue. So I tried very hard to make the dialogue, reveal things about the characters and reveal things about what was going on without just stating it obviously. And then if I was going to be so dependent on dialogue, I really wanted to make it sound like people talked back then. That was one of the more enjoyable parts of the book. And I also, because the character goes to, in the service, he ends up in England, and then in France before he is on the front lines. I picked up British dialect for some of the minor characters that appear. The main character goes over to England on the Queen Mary troop ship, as my father did in 1944. So I'm able to pick up some of the crew members of the Queen Mary and the very Cockney British accents there. And I hope I don't lose my readers with those, but I felt it was authentic, and I guess to some extent I've always had an ear for dialect and accents. I also became very interested and did way too much research into vaudeville, and vaudeville had its heyday from about the 1890s to the mid 1920s when movies started to come onto the scene. But in its day, for those 35 years, vaudeville was the form of entertainment in the United States. And even today, much of our entertainment has its roots in vaudeville. And certainly in my lifetime, the variety show is a direct descendant of vaudeville. So, for example, the Ed Sullivan Show of the late 50s and 1960s, which was required viewing back then, was simply a vaudeville show packaged for television. So I was very interested in that. And of course, these Jeep shows, the three performers up near the front lines, were essentially packaged vaudeville shows. And not only would they tell jokes with each other and do impressions and sing, but they would also almost always pull a soldier out of the audience who his buddies would say, Joe can do impressions, or Joe is a singer. And that a big part of the show is pull that guy out of the audience and have him perform for his buddies. And that also was the amateur section was a vaudeville tradition as well. So I really wanted to understand the roots of these shows, and I got way too interested in vaudeville.
You also obviously did a lot of research with the military references to weaponry and aircraft and uniforms and the other conditions of war. What kind of research did you do for those? Did you actually travel to those locations?
I actually did travel to the Ardennes. My son and I went 3 or 4 years ago and took a tour of the front lines. It was mostly fought on farms and in forests, and there aren't fortifications left where you can say, this happened here and this happened there. I did go to the village of Hosingen, which features in the book. That's where the protagonist gets stuck and then almost trapped by the Germans. And my son and I, from the village, literally walked down a road to the German border. And the German border is a stream about 6 feet wide and about a foot deep. So, there's a hill from that stream up to Hosingen, Luxembourg. So I got an invaluable kind of firsthand feel for the terrain and what it was like from that. I wanted, speaking of the weapons and the equipment, I really wanted to be authentic about that. And I think the more true the book is to facts, the better story it makes. This isn't supposed to be science fiction. And so I read many accounts from soldiers and picked up on a few things. I became fascinated with the M1 rifle, which was the standard issue rifle for American soldiers in World War II, and it was a automatic rifle. You put in a clip of 6 bullets, and you could fire them very quickly, and then you had to put in a second clip. Interestingly, some of these details, there was a condition called M1 thumb. And M1 thumb occurred when an inexperienced soldier or a careless soldier inserted the clip in his rifle to get 6 new rounds, and left his thumb in the way of the bolt, which snapped back very firmly and would leave at the very least, a significant bruised thumbnail. So without mentioning M1 thumb by name, our protagonist, Jim Hetzer, sometimes looks down at his thumb and kind of flexes it. I also became fascinated, Ernest, with the field jacket, also the M1 field jacket, because the American soldiers were given a lot of equipment. But when you're on the front lines, when you're in combat, you're constantly moving and you don't want to carry a lot of items. They were issued, the field jacket they were issued, I think it issued in 1943, had 4 huge pockets, two breast pockets and 2 hip pockets. And literally the combat men used that to carry, in one pocket they'd have a toothbrush, which they might not have used for a week, and a hand grenade. And in the other pocket, they'd have 3 K ration packs and, a letter from home. And then, one of those Army Service Edition books. But they did not want to carry a knapsack. Famously, they were all issued gas masks, and thank heaven, gas was never used in World War II as it was in World War I. And one of the first things that combat infantry did was throw away the gas mask and put other things in the gas mask holder if they kept that at all. So I became fascinated with the field jacket as a detail, and then and what they carried in it. And then lastly, the bazooka, which the Army called the M1 rocket launcher, which was nicknamed the bazooka. I became fascinated with that. It was kind of sold to the troops in training as a, tank killer. And indeed, if you fired the bazooka from fairly close to a German tank and you hit it in just the right spot, you might knock the tread, you might knock the tread off it. But in general, it was, a very dangerous weapon to fire because you had to be fairly close to what you were firing at, and the armor on German tanks was very, very thick, so it would be very difficult. And the protagonist is trained on the bazooka, I believe, at Fort Thomas before he gets assigned to the Morale Corps. And then he spends the rest of the war trying not to be assigned to carry a bazooka in combat, but instead he's happy to carry a rifle. So it was the details I found fascinating. And as you probably know, when you're very interested in a topic, research is fun. And research is fun and writing is hard. So it's very easy. It's very easy to over-research the topic, which I certainly did. And the only benefit is that I had 80% of the details I researched, there wasn't room for.
Yeah.
The only good part of that is the ones I selected were my favorites. So there is that.
You mentioned that your father was a World War II veteran. Did he speak a lot about his experiences? I know from interviews that I've conducted with war veterans, they're pretty reluctant to go into any detail about those experiences.
Of course, he did not speak anything about the Army, and nor did his younger brother, my Uncle George, who was a combat veteran of the Navy in the Pacific and fought for several weeks, was involved with the kamikaze attacks on American ships. No, they didn't talk about it, but I also have to admit that probably like most people, until I was in my mid-30s, I didn't really think of my parents as regular people with a history. I certainly loved them, tried to, and tried to respect them when I wasn't goofing off, but I didn't think about enough to say, tell me your story. Tell me what it was like for you. And boy, I wish I had, not just about the war, which would have helped this book, but also what it was like to grow up in the Depression, what it was like to be starting a family in the 50s. And I want to encourage any of your listeners whose parents are living to not wait to ask those questions, because I really regret that I didn't. I don't think either my father or my uncle would have talked much about their war experience, but I'm sure they would have had something to say.
Now I'm going to bring up a question
Sure.
which I would describe as loosely connected to your book.
Yes.
You mentioned it briefly in the author's note, and that is the Oxydol Circus and its
Yeah.
connection with Jim Hetzer and upon which the main character is based. And I found an article in Chief Marketer magazine,
Yes.
which
Yes.
told the story of the Oxydol Circus, and I think it's just not it's too good not to tell. But can you relate that to
Oh,
us?
I would love to. And I'm so glad you asked because that's actually how I ended up writing Jeep Show is after I wrote my first nonfiction book, I thought I would write about the Oxydol Circus, and that's how I discovered Jim Hetzer. Uh, I started my working life at that small soap company in Cincinnati called Procter and Gamble. I was sent to what was called remedial memo writing school at the time, early on, to learn how to write. To learn how to write, P&G back then was a written culture, and you had to learn how to do it the P&G way. It was taught by a man named Gib Carey. Gib Carey was a veteran at P&G, much beloved. Gib Carey had been the Oxydol brand manager. And for your younger listeners, Oxydol was a well-known brand of laundry detergent back in the day, much like Tide would be now. He was the brand manager of the Oxydol brand. He got a call from the lobby, and he was told, "There's a gentleman here to see you named Jim Hetzer." And he invited Jim up. Jim was promoting a circus at the time. He had his own Hetzer International Circus that he'd organized. And he somehow convinced Gib Carey, the Oxydol brand manager, to sponsor an Oxydol circus. The concept was, it would tour the country. They would tie in with grocery stores in the area. You could, for 2 Oxydol coupons, you could get a free ticket to the circus. A brilliant idea. And apparently everything that could go wrong went wrong. The lions were fed bad meat and they died, and they had to rent lions from Barnum and Bailey. Most importantly, they failed to notify the Shriners that they would be touring this circus around. And the Shriners, as you well know, are famous for the Shriners Circus. And back in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot more Shriners than there are today, and they worked at places like newspapers and railroad yards and supermarkets, and they never quite got around. The Shriners never quite got around to unloading the Oxydol Circus's equipment promptly, and somehow their newspaper ads ran upside down, and it just after the second city. Gib Carey, the brand manager, was called up to the 11th floor of the Procter & Gamble headquarters, which we called Valhalla back at the time. And Ed Harness, the chairman of Procter & Gamble at the time, Gib was ushered into his office, and Mr. Harness was looking out the window at the Ohio River. And he never turned around. He just said, "Mr. Carey, make it go away." and Gib Carey said, "Yes, sir," and turned around and made it go away. So the Oxydol Circus was and is a P&G legend, and Gib Carey spent most of our classroom time in the memo writing school telling us that and other fabulous Procter & Gamble legends. So I held on to that. This was in the very early 80s. I never forgot about that idea. And after I wrote my first book, I said, I'm going to write about the Oxydol Circus. But then I found out about who Jim Hetzer really was and what he had done in World War II. So the Oxydol Circus, Ernest, is going to be volume 3 in the trilogy. Oh. And I hope I live if I live that long, but I'm going to get to it. But this World War II story was just so gripping that I felt I should start with that. Thanks for asking, though.
So just before we go, Robert, one more question. In chapter 3, you had one of the minor characters make an interesting quote. It was Thomas Lloyd,
Yes, Tommy Boy. Yes.
Soldier, drummer for Britain's Sutherland Highlanders in World War One. So he said to Jim Tanzer, while Jim was in London waiting to be shipped to France, he said, "You'll find, Yank, you fight more for your mates than some idea, more than for your country." So how did you come up with that particular quote? Was that an actual statement that a veteran made to you?
I don't know if that was an actual statement. Thank goodness for fiction. You can make things up. But very much, I did a lot of research obviously on morale of the troops. And one thing I learned from many, many sources is, first of all, combat troops are very different than rear echelon troops. They're all serving. There's no easy jobs in the Army or the Navy or the Marines, but the combat troops are about 10% of the total troops, and they are oftentimes really suffering. They're out in the weather. Obviously, they are in danger of being wounded or killed. A lot of the good equipment never makes it to the front lines. The best clothing, the best food. And as we've talked about, the best entertainment, the best shows don't make it to the front line. And yet the combat soldiers are the ones, putting up with real danger. What I found from many, many accounts is, after they're into it, they are not motivated by freeing Europe from the evil Nazi empire. They are not motivated by the good old USA and even all the folks back home that they're protecting. They are motivated by their buddies, and what motivates them is looking after their buddies and being looked after by their buddies. So the relationships forged in combat during a war are very intense. They are often not long-lived. Many of these veterans did not, when they got home, they did not seek out, the guys they had been in foxholes with. Some of them did, and there were reunions. But in general, this was a very intense relationships, and they were motivated by standing up for their buddies. And in fact, many of your listeners will know the infantry divisions were never rotated out of the war. They literally fought the whole war. And if you were in an infantry division, the only way you would get out of the war is to be wounded, killed, or taken prisoner of war. So they had to be, they had to depend on each other. And if they were wounded and returned to duty, they would come back as fast as they could to their original unit, because these were their buddies. These were the guys they were fighting for. And secondly, you didn't want to be a replacement in a new unit, because being a replacement was very dangerous for a week or so until the new unit became your buddies.
Well, Robert, this has been so enjoyable and informative. Thank you for providing this important glimpse into what's mostly an unknown aspect of the Second World War. Thank you for spending time with us.
Oh, it was really, really my pleasure. Such good questions and such a great program. Thank you, Ernest.
Oh, very good. And I thank all of you for tuning in. For online information about this and other podcast topics, log on to outrageoushistory.com. And when you do log on to the website, don't forget to register to access the Outrageous History Members Lounge. For Outrageous History, I'm Ernest Granson.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.